Ever wondered what life was really like in the Middle Ages? It's a world we see in movies and games, filled with castles, knights, and kings. But how did it all actually work? Forget the fantasy for a moment, and let's dive into the real, gritty, and fascinating world of medieval Europe. At the very heart of medieval society was a system called feudalism. Imagine a giant pyramid at the very top. You have the king. Now, the king couldn't rule his entire kingdom all by himself. So, he'd grant huge chunks of land, called fiefs, to powerful nobles, his most trusted lords and vassals. In return for this land, these nobles promised the king their loyalty and, most importantly, military service. But it didn't stop there. Those powerful lords would then take their massive estates and divide them up, granting smaller parcels to lesser lords and knights. In exchange, these knights pledged to fight for their lord whenever he called. This created a complex web of mutual obligations. Power wasn't centralized like it is today. Your day-to-day security, your local laws, and your justice system didn't come from a distant king in a capital city. They came from your local lord, the one whose castle loomed over your village. And at the very bottom of this pyramid, the vast majority of people, the peasants, or serfs, they weren't slaves who could be bought and sold, but they weren't free either. They were bound to the land. Their entire world was the lord's estate, or manor. They worked the fields, raised the crops, and in return for all their labor, the lord offered them protection from bandits and rival lords. It was a tough life, but in a dangerous and fragmented world, this system provided a sense of order and security. Now, while political power was scattered all over the place, there was one institution that united almost everyone, from the mightiest king to the humblest peasant: the Catholic Church. It wasn't just a place for Sunday worship. It was the single most powerful and influential force across all of Europe. The Church provided a shared worldview, a common set of beliefs and values that transcended the borders of these petty kingdoms. It told people how the world was created, what their purpose was, and what awaited them in the afterlife. The Pope in Rome held immense spiritual and often political power, able to challenge kings and emperors. On a local level, the Church was the absolute center of community life. All of life's major milestones were marked there: baptism at birth, marriage as an adult, and burial at death. Monasteries were the Silicon Valley of their day. They were the sole centers of learning and literacy. Monks painstakingly copied ancient texts by hand, preserving the knowledge of Greece and Rome that might otherwise have been lost. The Church was also a massive landowner, making it a major economic player in its own right. And perhaps the most dramatic example of the Church's power was the Crusades. For centuries, the Church mobilized armies of knights and nobles from all over Europe, sending them on epic, dangerous journeys to the Middle East, with the goal of reclaiming the Holy Land. While the military results were mixed, the Crusades had huge unintended consequences. They reopened trade routes, exposed Europeans to new ideas, new technologies, and new goods, and ultimately helped broaden their horizons far beyond their own small villages. In the early Middle Ages, right after the collapse of Charlemagne's great empire, Europe was a patchwork of small, weak kingdoms. But over the centuries, a slow but steady process of consolidation began. Ambitious and clever monarchs in places like England, France, and Spain started to chip away at the power of their feudal lords. How did they do it? They started by creating royal bureaucracies, a team of educated officials loyal to the king, not to a local lord. They established royal courts and common laws that applied to the entire kingdom, replacing the mishmash of local customs. They raised their own armies, paid for with taxes, so they didn't have to rely solely on their vassals to fight for them. This centralization of power was a very long and often violent process. Nobles didn't give up their power willingly, but gradually, a sense of national identity started to form. People began to see themselves not just as subjects of the Duke of Normandy or the Count of Anjou, but as English or French. The age of scattered feudal power was slowly giving way to the age of unified kingdoms. So how did this medieval economy actually function? The engine of it all was a system called Manor. Think of it as the economic side of the feudal coin. The manor, or the lord's estate, was a self-sufficient little world. Almost everything needed for life was produced right there. The serfs worked the land. Some of the fields were the lord's domain, and all the food grown there went directly to his castle. Other fields were for the peasants themselves, to grow food for their families. In addition to farming, they had blacksmiths, millers, and weavers, all within the manor. There was very little trade with the outside world, and for a long time, money was rare. Instead, people bartered or paid their dues in the form of crops or labor. Life was predictable, stable, but also incredibly limited. But then, things started to change, especially in the later Middle Ages. The trade routes that had been reawakened by the Crusades started to flourish. New towns and cities began to spring up, independent of the feudal lords. And in these bustling urban centers, a new class of people emerged: the merchants, artisans, and bankers. This was the commercial revolution. Suddenly, wealth wasn't just about how much land you owned. It was about money, about trade, about creating and selling goods. This new urban middle class, the bourgeoisie, didn't fit into the old feudal pyramid. They had their own sources of wealth and power, and their rise began to seriously undermine the land-based, self-sufficient manorial system that had dominated Europe for centuries. To make sense of their world, medieval people thought of society as being divided into 3 distinct groups, or orders. This was seen as a natural, God-given structure. You were born into your place, and that was that. First, there were those who pray. The clergy. This group included everyone from the Pope and his cardinals down to the local parish priest and the monks in the monasteries. Their job was to care for the spiritual well-being of society and to act as the intermediaries between God and humanity. Second, you had those who fight. These were the nobles, the knights, and lords. Their role was to provide military protection and governance. They defended the kingdom from invaders and maintained justice and order, living by a code of chivalry that idealized courage, honor, and loyalty. And there were those who work. This was everyone else. The massive population of peasants and serfs who toiled in the fields. Their labor fed and supported the other 2 orders. They were the foundation upon which the entire structure rested. This 3 orders model wasn't a perfect reflection of reality, especially with the rise of the merchant class, but it powerfully reinforced the idea of a stable, hierarchical society where everyone had a specific, divinely ordained role to play. The late Middle Ages was a period of profound crisis and change, marked by events that would shatter the old world and pave the way for a new one. The first and most devastating blow was the Black Death. From 1347 to 1351, this terrifying plague swept across Europe, killing between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. The social and economic consequences were staggering. With so many people gone, there was a massive labor shortage. Suddenly, the peasants who survived found their labor was in high demand. They could demand better wages and more freedom. Many serfs abandoned their old manors for new opportunities, and the old manorial system, already weakened by trade, began to completely fall apart. The psychological impact was just as deep, shaking people's faith in the old certainties. At the same time, another major conflict was raging: the 100 Years' War between England and France. This long and brutal war had a transformative effect. It helped forge a much stronger sense of national identity in both countries. People weren't just fighting for a local lord anymore. They were fighting for their king and their country. The war also revolutionized warfare. The English longbow and the French cannon proved that massed infantry and artillery could defeat an army of heavily armored knights, signaling the decline of the knights' dominance on the battlefield. These crises, the plague, the endless wars combined with the long-term trends of growing cities, expanding trade, and the rise of powerful, centralized monarchies brought the medieval era to a close. The rigid feudal pyramid had cracked. The universal authority of the church was being challenged, and a new, more dynamic world was emerging. The stage was set for the Renaissance and the beginning of the early modern era. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the medieval world. If you found this fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time.